There were only 4 of us now. What had started off as a bit of an expedition at the beginning of the journey had slowly dwindled as the climb up the trail of Bridal Veil Falls became more and more treacherous. There had been a rest station about a quarter of the way into the hike, and 4 of the original 14 members of the group had already simply quit there. They had offered moral support, but stated firmly that they would wait right there for the rest of us when they came back down. And that was well over 6 hours ago. The rest of the hike had been so much harder than that initial first leg, and each time we reached a little reprieve from the arduous climb, 1 or 2 more of our members opted not to continue. This was a continuing trend throughout the day, as we'd leave a couple of people at a rest area or a calm clearing, only to have what came next on the trail be so much worse than what we'd already climbed. It felt almost like we were being punished for being abandoned by those who'd come with us. I couldn't blame anyone for quitting, honestly. I'd likely have quit, if I could have. But my dad was there, and my uncle, and I didn't want either of them to feel like I'd abandoned them. But still, every time there was a break, the pull to just sit there and wait was strong. But every time I listened to my dad groan as he got to his feet, and I felt like an absolute jerk for even thinking about it. Besides, it wasn't like the others had a stake in the purpose of the climb. They'd just been along for the ride. My dad, me, Uncle Mike, we were all there for a reason, and it was a good one. A friend of the family, Joshua, had passed away only a week before. He was just one of the most amazing human beings I'd ever met, and had been a best friend to Dad and Uncle Mike since they were kids. He'd lived a life, been in the military, traveled all over, and had ridden a motorcycle through pretty much every state in the United States. But it was a motorcycle that had gotten Joshua into a bad way about 25 years before the climb, and even before I was born. He'd gotten into a bad wreck and lost the use of his legs, and even though it had bound him to a wheelchair, he never complained about it. He'd been as bright a person after the accident as he had before, and perhaps even more so, and that's why it came as a great shock when he passed. Wheelchair or not, everyone thought Joshua was going to live forever. While Dad and Uncle Mike had been floored by the death of their friend, the fact that Joshua had made them the executors of his will hadn't been surprising at all. I remember when Dad read the will out loud, and he, Mom, Uncle Mike, and Aunt Julie all laughed out loud as Dad announced that Joshua wanted him and Mike, specifically, to climb up to Bridal Veil Falls to cast his ashes. It was exactly the kind of amazing yet obnoxiously inconvenient adventure Joshua had loved to do, and make others do. And of course, we were going to do it. Uncle Mike had just wanted him and Dad to go up, but my dad loved a huge family event, and took any and every excuse to bring as much of the family together as possible. So he called all of his kids, his nieces and nephews, and told them about the great undertaking. So many of us had jumped at the chance to be a part of Joshua's story in the beginning, especially me, since I didn't really know him well, even though I had heard all of the stories. Now, though, it was just me, Dad and Uncle Mike, and my cousin Ashley, who was in the army, and who had stated flatly that she wasn't going to be beaten by any trail. We'd almost made it to the summit of the peak where Bridal Veil Falls flowed. It was a less steep portion of the climb, which was a relief, as we'd all been climbing 90-degree embankments for half the hike. "Okay, I need a breather," Uncle Mike announced as he clambered over to a medium-sized boulder next to a tree to sit on. The old man noise that escaped his lips as he fell into a rest made me wince and smile at the same time, and I had to stop myself from chuckling. "Yeah, okay," Dad agreed as he sat down next to him, his back to the tree. "We're almost there, I think." "Yeah, well, you've literally said that 4 times, man," Uncle Mike groused after a swig from his water canteen. "Please, just shut the hell up." That drew a laugh from everyone, especially Dad. We sat there near the shady tree and just rested for a few minutes, talking about the trail and how far we'd all come. Ash mentioned that there was supposed to be a cabin at the summit with water, some food, and most importantly to her, a bathroom. We all agreed that we would take a good long break there whenever we reached it. After resting up a bit, we all got to our feet and continued the trudge up the peak towards our destination. It was even slower going now, because of the trail had gone steep again, and the little rest we'd all taken had made us a little tired. We finally came out of the trees close to the top of a ridge, the top of which I hoped would overlook the cabin Ashley had mentioned. The ridge itself dropped off sharply into a somewhat sheer and rocky face as well, so we moved to traveling single file to get to the top. And that's when something happened that scared me more than anything else. Now I'm going to relate to you in this tale of mine. Close to the top of that ridge, as my dad, who was leading the way just like he always did, was about to crest it, his foot hit a rock, which came loose under his weight and broke away from the rest of the trail. In seconds, the rock, the earth around it, and my dad were all sliding off the side of the ridge. I immediately panicked and called out to my father, drawing Uncle Mike and Ash's attention to the situation. Ash moved first to try and grab a hold of him, but his weight started to pull her with him. Mike came up behind her, shouting her name, now terrified for his daughter, as she started to fall over the side as well. But by the time I got close enough to do anything, both Ash and Dad were sliding down through the loose dirt, bound to topple over the edge. I was so scared in that moment that I genuinely started to tear up. The thought of him falling filled me with a sense of complete dread that I can't really even describe. 1,000 things went through my head at once. Everything I'd never said to him but meant to. All of the times I prioritized something fleeting over spending time with him. How would I tell my mother what had happened? All of these thoughts and more raced through my mind as I desperately scrambled to help. I got to Ash, who was already being held fast by her father, and tried to help him pull her and my dad up. Now, I'm not the strongest guy, and I'm not what you would call peak physical shape, so this was not going well. I remember reaching out in my mind to God or Buddha or whoever might be listening for help. I even remember mouthing the word please as I desperately tried to pull my family away from the brink. And that's why what occurred next felt so unnerving afterwards. As I stood there practically hanging over the side of this high peak, holding on to my cousin who was holding on to my dad, someone or something grabbed at me. I felt my belt being grabbed by a strong hand, which I, at first, thought was Uncle Mike. It couldn't have been him though, because he was right next to me, grabbing at Ash's other arm. Whoever or whatever grabbed me at that moment was strong, because I felt my whole body weight get pulled backwards, and with me came Ash. When she'd made it back onto solid ground, Mike and I scrambled to get Dad and to pull him up as well. When everyone was over the lip and I was sure they were safe, I spun around and scanned the area behind us for whoever it might have been, but there wasn't a soul in sight. There wasn't even any movement to speak of between where we stood at the top of the peak and the tree line some 100 or so feet behind us. "Good Lord," my dad exclaimed as he shook off the panic, pulling me from my worried searching. "Thank you. Is everybody okay?" He looked first to Ashley, but then his eyes went to Mike, and then me. When my dad looked to me with worry on his face, I just started to cry. I'm not even sure I know why, but I couldn't stop crying for a minute. We hugged it out, the way Dad always did, the way our whole family always did, and just took a minute to look over the ridge and the sheer drop, which was likely closer to 200 feet. After making sure no one was hurt and contemplating what had just occurred, and how all of our lives could have been irrevocably changed because of it, we took a breath, then made our way the last few meters up the ridge as carefully as possible. As we reached the top, the rocky ridge gave way to a tiny cove, within which was the cabin that Ashley had mentioned earlier. All around us, the forest of fir trees we traveled through to get there spread out as far as the eye could see around the peak. It was one of the most amazing things I'd ever personally seen in my life, and I'd almost started to cry again when I saw it. We took a good long time to take in the whole of the sight, knowing that despite his masterminding of this trip, seeing this view had, at least in part, been what Joshua had wanted for all of us. I remember feeling genuine pity for those who had not made it that far, and wished we'd all reached the top together. The thing was, this still wasn't the top. I realized as my eyes passed over the dell with the cabin, which looked a lot more like a store now, that the trail dipped down into the cove, then back up again in an even higher height on the other side of which was, presumably, the actual waterfall. Though that had only been an assumption on my part, in truth. We weren't done yet, and the realization of it made me want to nap so damn badly. After catching our breaths again, my family and I all enjoyed the nice, easy downhill stint of the trail, which led almost directly to the cabin. As we got closer, I could see that the cabin had an open sign on the door. It also seemed to have electricity, which I thought was peculiar given how high up we were. But I was also grateful. Power potentially meant a fridge with cold, clear water. I went up to the door and knocked, but when no one answered, I tried the door and found it open. The inside of the cabin was simple, but had all the simple amenities one might expect in a remote cabin. There were sleeping pads, a complete kitchen with a wooden stove, and while there wasn't a fridge, there was water, which was stored in an underground tank, which was quite cool. The cabin was meant as a hiker's rest stop and meant to provide shelter to travelers on the trail. Most helpful of all was the bathroom, which everybody made use of in turns. Dad and Mike let Ash and I go first, as Dad had discovered not only an electric kettle, but a coffee press and a bag of grounds. While I wasn't much of a coffee drinker, the looks of delight on my dad and Mike's faces when they had found it almost washed away the fear of their previous experience. Once we'd all been relieved and hydrated ourselves fully, we all went out onto the porch of the cabin to sit on the steps and to sip on small cups of hot coffee. Well, they all did. There was some tea bags with the coffee as well, so I had a cup of that to enjoy with them in solidarity. We sat there for a good 10 minutes, chatting about the climb, reeling about the near fall, and reminiscing about Joshua. While we were sitting there, Ash turned her head towards the trail, which continued to the waterfall and the highest point of the climb. She snapped her head in that direction as though she'd heard something, and suddenly reached to her pocket of her cargo pants for something. Dad asked her what was wrong, but after a moment, she shook her head and said that it was nothing. I hadn't heard anything myself, but Ashley wasn't the kind of person to make a big deal about a weird noise, especially not in broad daylight. Though it was at that point that I noticed that the sunset was closer than I had expected. "Well," Dad stated as he took the last sip of his coffee and got to his feet, "ain't nothing to it but to do it." He then took everyone else's cup back to the cabin to clean up. We all got up then and prepared to leave. me personally going back in to grab a cup of water, as I wasn't sure if we'd stop there again. After we got everything put away, we headed up the trail. Ash took the lead this time and moved on ahead of us. Uncle Mike called after her a few times, and while she always paused, whenever we got started together again, she invariably sped further along again. It felt like she was looking for something, or like she wanted to find something before we got to it. At first, I thought it was just a waterfall, but every so often she'd pause and scan the tree line along the trail. Suddenly, I perked up and smiled as I heard the sound of rushing water ahead of us. Our goal was so close I could feel it, and I announced my realization to everybody else. There were smiles all around as their ears perked up, and they heard the roar as well, even from Ash, who seemed to have at least temporarily abandoned her search for whatever she'd been looking for. While everyone was very excited, Uncle Mike reinforced the need for caution and reminded us all to take our time. So we picked our way slowly along the last leg of the trail, and my heart leapt as we got to the top of the last crest, and I could feel the cold spray of vapor on my face. There before us was the rushing waters of Bridal Veil Falls, cascading down the mountainside. We'd made it. We were there. Dad exclaimed loudly when he saw the falls and continued up the path, taking the lead now. We all followed, and soon, we were only feet from the edge of the waterfall. There was no way to get up any higher without taking our lives back into our hands, so this was as close as we were going to get. Dad pulled his backpack in front of him and retrieved the metal canister which contained the ashes of Joshua. Just as Dad was about to unscrew the lid, a horrible sound, somewhere between the bleating of a goat and the roar of a bear. When I turned, I could not believe what I saw. There, standing above us on a rocky outcropping above the falls, was what I can only describe as a goatman or satyr of ancient Greek mythology. It was well over 7 feet tall, and it carried some kind of staff upon which was thrust the head of a deer. Dad shouted in alarm, and Ash half screamed, half growled something incoherent at the thing. Uncle Mike backed away from it, trying to get between it and Ashley, but she shouldered past him as she reached into her pocket for something. The creature raised its staff and roared again as it brought it down with a loud clack on the stone upon which it was standing. All I remember doing was going very, very still and being completely shocked at what I was seeing. It all seemed so surreal, like I was dreaming, and I thought for a moment that I was going to wake up sitting on the steps of the cabin, having simply fallen asleep. And that's when I heard something really odd, almost more strange than the creature. All the way up there on the top of that peak, next to the waterfall and far from the trappings of civilization, I heard of all things, the sound of her motorcycle revving. The oddness of it was what snapped me back into reality, and I suddenly realized that my dad was holding on to my arm and trying to pull me back down the trail. Then I heard the shots, first one, then another, and I looked back up to see Ash having pulled out a gun that I was completely unaware of her owning. She'd fired twice at the creature, causing it to crouch down low. I couldn't see any wounds, but I got the distinct feeling that it was afraid, which was reinforced by it slamming its deer-headed staff onto the rock again. Only this time, the whole side of the ridge shook when it did. I looked at my dad then, in sudden realization, and we both looked at Uncle Mike and Ash, who wore knowing looks. This thing, whatever it was, had caused the trail to collapse earlier. We knew it. Moreover, we all knew intrinsically that it could and likely would do so again. We had to get the hell out of there, and soon. "Come on!" Uncle Mike shouted as he grabbed Ash by the arm and bolted back down the trail. Dad followed and I was right behind him until I noticed something shiny on the ground which gave me pause. It was the container with Joshua's ashes. Dad had dropped them when he'd come over to help me and forgotten to grab them, or had simply abandoned them there. I don't know why, but when I saw them sitting there, my attention was drawn back up to the creature on the rocks above, and when I met its strange rectangular eyes, I knew that the ashes were what it was after. It roared again, this time right at me, as I dropped to one knee to retrieve the ashes. When I stood up, the thing had moved closer to me, and was bleat roaring almost as loud as the rushing waters behind me. Now I can't say where I drew the courage that came to me next, but I knew in my head that leaving the ashes there for this thing to have would be just wrong. I stood up, unscrewed the canister, and ran over to the edge of the cliff overlooking the waterfall. The creature's roar grew somehow louder, and I knew then that casting the ashes into the waterfall was the last thing it wanted. With a great heave, I launched the canister directly into the waterfall and watched as the ashes plummeted out into a cloud which was utterly absorbed by the cascading waters. Whatever had been left of Joshua now belonged to Bridal Veil Falls. Behind me the creature growled, and I turned to see that it was much closer, and was raising its staff into the air again. I scrambled forward as the staff came down on the earth, and the ground shifted beneath my feet. Each step seemed to take me nowhere, and I could feel myself losing my footing as I kept pressing forward. And that's when I felt it again. Something or someone had taken a hold of my belt, and for a moment I thought it was somehow the creature, that its evil power had somehow grasped me. But then I was flung forward, away from the cliff's edge. Then I heard a familiar pop, and then another, followed by the sound of the creature roaring again. I felt the hands of my father and my uncle pulling me to my feet and back down the trail, past Ash, who was pointing her pistol at the thing behind us. The wide-eyed look on her face told me that while her attack had thwarted its plans for me, it had not the effect she expected. Once I had found my footing, I ran for all that it was worth. We tried to be careful on the way back, especially considering what the goatman seemed capable of, but our fear of it urged haste. Every single time I looked back at us as we ran, it was there. Whether atop a higher ridge or in a tree, or just standing on the trail behind us, it was there. The first time I looked back and didn't see it, we'd arrived at the cabin. That's when I noticed that the sun was dipping very low towards the horizon. How that could possibly have happened when it had only been sunset when we had arrived at the falls, I could not explain. But there was much about that last hour or so that I simply could not explain. We didn't bother stopping at the cabin, but ran straight back up to the ridge where Dad had almost fallen, giving the edge of the cliff a wide berth as we passed. Finally, we hit the trees, and for whatever reason, I felt somehow safer here. It was as though the trees somehow provided cover, while the cabin now felt like it had been a false sense of security. We retraced our steps back down to our little rest spot, but just keep going, not knowing whether we were still being followed. Dad started to mutter about Mom and the others, and I only then realized that they too could be in danger, and had no knowledge of it. When I realized this, I almost started to cry again, because as bad as almost losing my dad was, losing the rest of my family was even worse. "Shit!" Ashley yelled at all of us, seemingly trying to get us to stop. "We took a wrong turn somewhere back there. None of this looks familiar." She looked around at the trees, which were suddenly seemingly less safe in the deepening darkness. "Oh no. I think you're right, Ash," Dad exclaimed, turning around and scouring the area behind him for a landmark. "Where the hell did we lose the trail?" He cast about, and I knew that he was really worried, which made me even more frightened for my mom and my siblings. There was no way to call them, even if they were close, because there just wasn't a signal this far up into the mountains. Just as Uncle Mike had suggested that we double back, I heard something off in the woods. It sounded vaguely like people talking. Not any specific words or voices, but incoherent chatter off to the west, back up the trail. And for a moment, I thought we'd simply passed the handful of friends and family we'd left behind, but then realized that the sound was coming from the wrong direction. "There," Uncle Mike declared as he turned toward the sounds, but he was held firm by Ash, who gripped his arm. "No," Ashley intoned seriously as she let go of Mike's arm and leveled her handgun at the trees where the sound was coming from. "Yeah, sounds wrong, Dad. It doesn't sound like them." She took a threatening step towards the trees, and we all listened as the sounds jumped from that direction to sound as though they were coming from the north now. "What in God's name?" Dad exclaimed as he edged closer to the rest of us again. "What do we do?" The sound shifted location again, now coming from the same direction as before, but closer, and we all jumped. Just as it felt like we'd be trapped in those woods until the sun was gone, I heard it again. The sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance off to the east, further down the climb. It was unmistakable, and I called out incoherently when I heard it. The others seemed to hear it as well, and when my dad's eyes met mine, he smiled sadly. Without another word, we all bolted in the direction of the revving sound, jumped over brush and rocks, and who the hell knows what else in the deepening dark. I saw the light of a campfire, which the motorcycle seemed to be coming from, and veered toward it, calling out to everyone else. We didn't stop until we entered a clearing, where I was sure I'd find a Honda street bike, but instead, we found my sister, her boyfriend, and our other cousin who we'd left there several hours before. There were many worried greetings and relieved smiles and hugs, and some more crying on my part. But it was all very rushed as Dad made every effort to get them all out of there as quickly as possible. I somehow knew we were out of trouble, even if we were still in the woods, but I wasn't sure why. And that's when I saw several stacked cairns of stones just outside the campsite clearing. We'd missed them when we come up through before, but I know I jumped clear over one of them, thinking it was a stump. There in the darkness of the dusk on that mountainside, just on the other side of the cairns, were two eerie glowing rectangular eyes, staring back at me in rage. When I saw them, I almost cried out, but then felt a familiar and comforting hand on my shoulder. I turned to see my dad standing next to me, looking worried, but also somehow pleased. "I'm really proud of you, Rich," my dad said to me out of nowhere as he pulled me further along back down the trail. "Joshua would be too." When I looked back, the eyes were gone.